Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're gonna be reviewing Lotus by Soen.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
This album was definitely something interesting and pretty surprising, but I'm gonna get into that in just a moment. But here are some of my favorite bits from this album. So we are gonna take a look today at the album called Lotus by the Swedish band Soen. Now this band was formed back in 2014 by ex-Opeth drummer Martin Lopez, and together they created 5 studio albums, the first one coming out in 2012 and the last one coming out last year in 2021, and the album that we're reviewing today came out in 2019. Now I experienced a bunch of difficulty in getting to actually listen to this album, and I don't mean the actual listening process, I mean getting to listening to it, to sit down and have a listen. And the reason for it is because I knew that this was going to be a metal album. This album will presumably sound kind of like Opeth, which they are pretty much metal in nature. And if you know this series and if you know me, you know that I dread metal most of the times. Now it isn't justified. So far we've listened to a lot of great metal works which I've rated highly because they were genuinely great, but honestly I couldn't bring myself to listen to this album because I wasn't really expecting anything good to come out of it. But you know what? This album actually isn't all that bad. And yes, this album does start with what I kinda expect. It starts off with pretty basic metal songs, although there's one thing I really liked about them is the fact that they had really nice C parts that went down. They were calmer, they were more atmospheric, they were actually more exciting to listen to, although they were not so heavy-handed. And their basic structure looks something like starting off pretty heavy, going for that for the most of the song, then at the midpoint going down to those quieter C parts that I told you, and then coming back up to a grand finale, and all of that was fine and all. But then all of a sudden we were introduced to the 4th track, the title track, my personal favorite, called Lotus. And with that track the band stopped hammering on their music and actually approached it in a calmer way, a more atmospheric way, a more heartfelt way in some way, and even somewhat Floydian. Yes, this one kind of felt to me like some later Pink Floyd. Instead of heavy guitarists, we actually received some really nice Gilmour-like solos on the guitar, and instead of very bass drum heavy and tom-tom heavy drum playing, we actually received some amazing work on the cymbal by Lopez. And honestly, the only reasoning I can find to this album having such a huge shift in nature and its pace in the midsection maybe is because Soen were trying to attract some sort of people into their music, thus they have to begin this album in a way that would attract many people, but when they had them in the palm of their hands, they shifted their music, it metamorphosized into something that they wanted to create, and honestly something that I much preferred. Now this album is categorized as post-metal, and the reasoning for it is now all clear to me. After listening to this entire album and the songs that came from the 4th track onwards, I realized that the music on here is much more mature, well thought out, and very different from what you'd expect off of basic metal music. And you know, I was really surprised by this, especially especially with the last track. I thought that track in particular, clocking in at almost 9 minutes if I'm right, that track specifically was very calm, very somber in some way, very environmental, very atmospheric, very spacey in many ways, and it was absolutely beautiful to listen to it. And at the end, I was definitely 100% sure that it was gonna ramp up, go back into the heaviness this album began with, and then, you know, climax at the ending, but it didn't. It just drifted off. It was beautiful. It was so lovely. I didn't expect this from this album, and honestly, I am very much pleased. So yeah, as I said, I was ready to be disappointed by this album, but I was featured with something completely different, which I really liked. Now, I must add something that is quite important. The songs on Lotus aren't anything new. They have been done many times before by many different bands in many different ways, and the sounds I heard on here are, as I said, nothing new. But I much prefer to look at this album as if it's the only one of its kind, much like I do with all the albums I review on here. So when doing research for this album, I read a lot of reviews by people saying, yeah, this is a great album. This has really good music and overall, but it's so repetitive. Everything has been done in the past and I cannot appreciate that, and thus it has been given lesser reviews. But you know, my own ideology is that everything was done, it was made, someone tried doing it in the past. Nothing's really new, everything is just recycled by someone else, whether they know it or not, and thus I should look at each and every album as if it's something special by its own self, not try and do any comparisons, and just appreciate the music for what it is. And with the case of this album, although I am well aware that this has been done many times before, as it stands, Lotus by Soen is definitely something original, unique, and very much fun to listen to. Because let's face it, if I wanted to compare each and every album to other albums, I would compare them all to an album like The Dark Side of the Moon, and no one would get a rating higher than 3. So yeah, this album might have been fun because I listened to it in some sort of blissful ignorance, but honestly I enjoyed it and that's all that matters. And next time when I see a metal album coming up on the list, I shouldn't dread it. This is the time where I have to come to some self-acceptance and realize that metal music is a lot of times surprising, very fun. Sometimes it is repetitive, but so is any other subgenre of prog. So yeah, that's about it. Let's move on to the cover. So this cover is pretty fine overall. I don't think it's bad in any way. I think they could have done it better to fit the music of this album, but honestly the thing is I don't appreciate it as much because I happened to stumble upon the other covers by Soen, and honestly I'm just gonna shift them over here on the side or something so you can see them and see how so freaking cool and creative they are compared to the cover we are reviewing today. Like in comparison, this cover is just, it's fine, it's okay. I don't really like it all that much. In the context of this music, I think it could have fit much better to the sounds of Lotus in many ways. I find that the sounds on Lotus feature something more atmospheric, more ambient sounds, something which is even somewhat biblical in some sense, very religious, and I think they could have represented it better in the cover. But what the heck do I know? Honestly, I couldn't make a better representation than this one, so I guess it's fine. I really like the colors on here. There's little colors on here and they're really fine, and I think this cover could have been done differently, but as I said, I don't know how. So when it comes to the rating of this album, this one gets an 8 out of 10. I don't believe that there are any songs on here which are really perfect in any way. I think they're all pretty much nearing perfection to some extent. Some are better, some are worse, but honestly an 8 out of 10 is really fitting for this one. But that's about it, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're going to be listening to 4 Visions by Eschaton, maybe the most notorious Zool album out there. I also want to thank my lovely supporters over on Patreon, so thank you so much to Clay, Walnum, and Brian. You guys are the best, and if you want to support me over on Patreon, you can find the links down in the description or in my About page. But that's about it, guys. Have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye, guys.